What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YJ from Zero, back with another Retro Yu-Gi-Oh video and back with another tournament report because another tournament has wrapped up in one of the retro formats that I've covered. So let's talk about it because the Chaos Return format tournament held in the YGO from Zero Discord server, linked in the description down below if you want to join in future tournaments like that, just wrapped up the other day. And it was a pretty fun event. It wasn't as big as some of the other Chaos Return format tournaments that have been held in the past. You know, there was a previous one held in Format Library that got 32 people. This one only got 25 people. But still, it was a pretty lively event. There were a lot of great players in it, and they brought a lot of very interesting decks to the table. So before we dive into this sort of deck type representation that people brought, if you like this sort of content, subscribe to the channel just so you'll be updated on when I release more videos like this. And also, it helps grow the community more, make these tournaments even bigger in the future. But with that being said, let's dive into the deck type representation here. And as a note, this deck type representation is coming from Format Library. It's great that they produce these coverages and, just build in the charts into the coverages. So that's very nice. And it's a great service that they do, but, it is always important to take these sorts of things with a grain of salt, as sometimes certain decks are classified as one thing when actually they're more similar to another thing. So, that's just one of the flaws of, just online coverage. Deck types might get sort of a bit malleable, depending on what the algorithm thinks they are. But, if you look at the deck type representation here, you'll see that for Chaos Return format, a lot of people brought Chaos. Chaos Control was the most represented deck in the tournament. It was 7 people bringing it, and it did pretty well. There were a lot of Chaos players in the top cut there. Now, that being said, there were some decks labeled as Chaos, which I'm not sure if I'd necessarily call them Chaos. They maybe were playing like a one of Chaos Sorcerer or something. But, I'm not sure if I necessarily call them that, but it still, is important to mention that Chaos is a major feature in this format. Chaos Sorcerer is a card that even decks that aren't going full in on Chaos might want to play. And so, it is good to know about if you want to play this format. The next highest represented deck was Anti-Meta Stun with 4 players. And that sort of just more decks that are playing things like, Macro Cosmos or Dimensional Fisher or Banisher of the Radiance. And, just cards that can banish cards, prevent them from hitting the graveyard because that deals with things like Chaos. It, stymies Monarchs a little bit because Treeborn Frog gets banished. Also, you can't activate Last Will there. Stymies Dark Worlds as well. So there are a lot of decks that are hurt by Anti-Meta Stun, and so that's why those decks are sort of lumped together there. But that had 4 players, which makes sense given that the last tournament in Chaos Return format was won by a deck like that. So it makes sense that people are trying to run that back, see if that deck has legs. Stein Monarch also very well represented here. I mean, that's just one of the most powerful decks in this era of the game. Just if you can turbo out Stein, you're winning the game, right? And there are other decks that do turbo out Stein as well, but Monarchs is a great shell for it because it naturally triggers Last Will, gets out big guys, sets up an OTK. So Stein Monarch, pretty good deck in this format. Next up, we got 2 players on Dark World Burn, and Dark World Burn is a deck that did well at the last event in this format. So it makes sense why people brought it back here, although 2 people is kind of a bit less than I expected because it is a bit of a spicy deck that does have some competitive legs. But, for that small representation there, it actually managed to win the tournament. Spoiler alert. And so, only one of the Dark World players made it into the top cut, I believe. But that one player won the whole thing. So, very, very good deck. And I'll be getting into a tier list later in the video because I think that, it's very exciting to sort of take these results and translate them to a tier list because I think that it, was a pretty good test of certain decks in the format. I think Dark World Burn is definitely going to see a lot more play in the future because of its results here and because the deck can just get really, really aggressive. Next up, we've got Chaos Control, no, not Chaos Control, Other. Misread the chart. We got Other at 2. I'm not exactly sure what the other decks were, but they clearly didn't fit into any other category here. I think Library FTK was brought by one person, so that's probably one of the others, but I'm not exactly sure which other deck was classified as Other here. But then, moving on from that, we got 6 players, which were sort of just one-off decks. 1 person on Chaos Monarch, 1 person on Go Control, 1 person on Chaos Return, 1 person on Macro Monarch, 1 person on Stein OTK, 1 person on Warrior. And again, those sorts of labels are flexible. Some decks that, might be playing Return might be classified as Chaos Return versus, just Chaos Control or Chaos Monarch or something like that. Other decks that are playing Stein OTK, maybe they are going all in on the Stein OTK stuff and should be classified as that. Maybe they're playing a bit of a Monarch package as well and should be classified more in that vein. It's tough to say. And some Warrior decks, they're playing things like DD Survivor, things like that, in addition to, Dimensional Fissure or other things. So, those decks, are they more warrior? Are they more anti-meta stun? Who can say? So, it's always good to take these sort of categories with a grain of salt. And just keep in mind that sometimes, the line between two different deck types might be thinner than you might expect. But, I'm not going to spend too much time on the deck category representation. But, this format is more of an aggressive format. Even though Control has a major slice of the pie here, Stein existing makes it very, very aggro at different times. Graceful Charity speeds up the game a lot as well. So I would say, while you can have some grindy games where, you're playing against a Chaos Control deck, or you're playing the Chaos Control deck and you're sort of trying to out-resource your opponent and stuff like that, a lot of the time the games just turn into, aggro fest. Just tons of aggression early on, either to try and drop your opponent down below the 5,000 life point threshold range they need for Stein, or because the game just ends because the Stein activation happens, right? So, I think the deck category representation, you should take this with an even larger grain of salt, maybe a whole shaker of salt if you want. But that's going to do it for my discussion of these graphics. Let's dive into the topping deck lists and discuss what I think that means for those deck lists in the future. So firstly, in 9th place, this wasn't technically a topping deck list, but because it bubbled, I think Format Library includes in the coverage, we got the Inexperience on Chaos Monarchs. And this is a pretty good Chaos Monarch deck. It's doing a lot of interesting things as well. Playing Assure Priest here, 1 Tomato going into Newdoria is neat. Also Double Reaper here as well. So very, very cool stuff here. I mean, not much to say about this. If you've seen one Chaos Monarch list, you've seen most of the Chaos Monarch lists out there, I think. Because, it's a very standard deck. You're just trying to do Monarch things with things like Trueborn Frog or Cyber Dragon and stuff. But you've also got the Chaos Orcs here to bring out after, you've gone through the Cyber Dragons, the Zaborgs, or your other dark monsters here. Interesting thing to note, they are playing Mobius in the main. A lot of decks don't play Mobius in the main. They play it in the side instead. But, that's kind of interesting. No Stein here as well, even though they are playing a Last Will. So that's kind of interesting as well. No Stein in the side deck either. So, some interesting choices here for sure. But this is, just Chaos Monarch, it's if you've seen the Chaos Monarch list, you know what this does and you know what it looks like. But still very, very good deck list if you do want to pick up a Chaos Monarch list. If you don't want to go in the Stein route, but you still want a powerful Monarch deck, then this could be one for you. Moving into the topping deck list proper, tied in 5th place, we've got Jim Bob on Chaos Control. And, again, this getting back to what I said when I was discussing the different deck types, is this Chaos Control? Is this Steinarch? Who's to say, right? There are Chaos Sorcerers here. There's a Monarch package here. So should this be Chaos Monarch? I don't know. It's tough to say. I would personally probably classify this list as a Chaos Control list and more as a Monarch list. Because you are playing the Stein and the Last Will package there. And, I mean, you are playing double Sorc, so, that is more of a Chaos engine there. But, I don't know. It's decks like this that really do sort of put a stress test on the categorizer because how exactly do you classify this, so I mean, yeah, it's tough to say in the top 8 there, but I do think that this is a very, very good deck list if you want a sort of Steinarch game plan that also plays Chaos because it's Chaos Return format. This is a good one for you. I mean, again, not too much special to say here. If you know what this sort of deck does, then you know what this does. Basically, you're setting up the Monarchs to, make aggressive pushes that way, but you've also got Stein in the deck to go into if you've got Last Will online, or just to go into if you've got over 5,000 life points and you think you can kill your opponent, Pretty standard stuff. This is one of the most powerful decks of this era, and if you want a good place to start with it, this is definitely one of them. As a note, Jim Bob's also playing the Mobius in the main, so maybe this card's a bit more prevalent than, I made it out to be when discussing Inexperience's deck list, but I think most of the other decks in the top cut weren't playing Mobius in the main, just in the side deck, but still a very interesting card to include here, and especially if you're going for a Stein push, it can be very good to pop your opponent's stuff. Next up, we've got Food on another deck classified as Chaos Control. I potentially would call this Apprentice Monarchs because you're playing the Apprentice Magician package here, but I'm not sure if Apprentice Monarchs is a categorization in the system there, but I think there's Apprentice Monarchs. You've got the swaps to pair with the Apprentice Magicians. You've got the Double Magician of Faith here to go into off Apprentice Magician. So, I think this is Apprentice Monarch, and that's a very, very good deck in this format. Creature swap plus Apprentice Magician now works the way you'd think it would work in this format, where, you activate Creature swap, give your opponent an Apprentice Magician, you attack over it. You do get to bring out a Spellcaster monster from your deck set face down, and that can be very good. Also just very good, your opponent attacks into your Apprentice Magician, bring out a Magician of Faith next turn, you flip it up, get a powerful spell back, and you then tribute that off for a Monarch. That can be very, very strong. So, this is a pretty good deck in this format. Some interesting things here. Pot of Avarice to recycle your resources there. Decree in the main. Decree in the main is definitely not a, super common inclusion in a lot of these decks, but it does make sense if you're trying to go for a big Monarch push or a big Stein push even. Having Decree up to shut off the traps is pretty nice. So, all told, is a pretty good Apprentice Monarch list if you want to play Apprentice Monarch. And so, it's one that you should pick up if you like the deck. The next 5th place player in Top Cut was Andrew Underscore with this list, which was classified as Chaos Control. And I mean, this is really pushing the boundary of this because I would call this a zombie list. It's not playing a Ryu Koki here, which is kind of interesting. You'd think with the Turtles, they'd go for Koki, but you don't really need Koki, right? Koki's just kind of a break in a lot of situations. If you're going into Reaper, that's generally good enough a lot of the time. So I think this does make sense. You can give your opponent a turtle off creature swap, and then attack over the turtle, go into a Reaper, rip a card out of their hand, so that's pretty nice. Yeah, very, very neat list. Also playing a return package here, because you are playing your Chaos stuff, so that's probably why this deck is classified as Chaos Control. But, I think most people looking at this list would call it, like, Zombie Return or something like that. It is a bit awkward because, like, the only way you have to banish your own stuff is through things like Chaos Orc. You do have the DD Warrior Lady and the DD Assailant as well to do that as well, but, like, you don't have things like Gigantes to banish your zombies if you want that. But, since they're not playing Koki, I don't really think that matters as much. And this is just sort of a good engine, kind of like the Apprentice Monarchs, where, like, your Apprentice Magicians are going into your Spellcasters. You got Turtles going into your Zombies. So I think that that's a pretty good engine as well. So cool to see Andrew Underscore bring this thing and put Zombies on the map a bit. For the last of the 5th place players in Top Cut, we got Alfia 2. Bring in an anti-meta stun deck here. And this is very similar to the list that they brought to the last Chaos Return tournament, which they actually managed to win, playing a sort of Banisher stun deck. They're playing Dimensional Fissures in that as well. Here they cut the Dimensional Fissures, just playing the Banisher of the Radiance, and I actually really like that choice a lot. I think a lot of the time with the Dimensional Fissures, if you play Dimensional Fissure, it can brick in your hand or you just don't draw it, and that can be awkward. It also explains why they're not playing the DD Survivors because, even if you're able to set up that recurring loop there, if you've only got the Banisher, it's a lot less resilient. And also, what does that really do for you if you're not playing Monarchs to convert off it? Not much. So I think that, this is a much smarter list here. The Banishers can deal with the Treeborn Frogs and things like that, and just be annoying for your opponent to deal with in general. You can also shut off things like Last Will as well, which is pretty good. Although Alfia 2 is playing a copy of Last Will of their own to go into Stein, because they do have ways to go into that. They've got Exiled Force here, which they can search off Rhoda, so that's an instant Stein, summon in case you've got the Last Will there. You've got Side Retreat over your own stuff. So there are a lot of ways that you can do stuff with that. Also, Econs here, tribute your own stuff, take control of an opponent's monster, go into Stein. Very, very strong as well. So I think this list is really, really slick. And I think if you do want to play an anti-meta stun deck, with the Banishers and things like that, this is the sort of list that you should be bringing in the future, or at least starting with as a base, because I think this deck is really, really good. Also, I want to mention Chiron the Mage. Very, very cool card. 1800 attack, can pop spell and traps by discarding a spell. So that's also a kind of another neat inclusion here. But, again, this sort of blurs the line between, is this anti-meta stun? Is it Warriors? Who's to say? And I think that, that sort of thing is in the eye of the beholder. But I call this anti-meta stun. I think it's close enough to anti-meta stun that it should be included in that. Or you can just call it like a banishing deck if you want to as well. Moving on into the 3rd place deck list, we got Splevin here on Steinarch. And, they're playing these Hydrogeddons, which is it's a tech that people have been playing for a while, but people have moved away from it. People have gone back to it. It definitely varies in terms of like whether people are actively playing this in the deck or not. But I do like Hydrogeddon. It can beat over your opponent's thing, get in for 1600 additional damage, can also get more bodies on board, deck thin for you. So I think it's a really cool inclusion. And this deck did very, very well. I mean, Splevin's a great player in these formats as well. So that's also a big part of it. But this shows that like Steinarch, like if you want to go more all in on the Stein stuff, you can definitely do that and do well with this Steinarch package here. So very, very good list. Also, I want to mention Triple Dust Shoot. It was in Alfia 2's list as well, but Triple Dust Shoot becoming more popular here, which makes sense because, it's good against Monarch. Monarch's a very, very popular deck in the format, but it's good against a lot of decks in the format. Just getting the hand knowledge first turn and also being able to shuffle back their best monster is very, very good. So yeah, I mean, Dust Shoot, I definitely think this card will be on the rise in the future, which is a bit unfortunate, but it's a fact of these older formats that people will be playing Dust Shoots now that people sort of awakened to how good this card is. The other 3rd place deck list was Kesha on this sort of Chaos Control list. But again, this sort of blurs the boundaries a bit of Chaos Control because it is playing a warrior package. You know, you've got your Mystic Swordsman level 2, the Exiled Force, and the Rhoda as well, and the DD Warrior Lady here as well to search off that. But I would classify this as firmly Chaos Control. Well, yeah, I think it's just Chaos Control. I was going to say you could maybe say Go Control because it's playing Ghost, but it's not playing meta, so that doesn't really make sense to call it that. So, yeah, I think this is Chaos Control, playing the decrees in the main, just like Food was. I do think that this might become more popular in the future. So if you're playing a trap-heavy deck, you might see a bit of a harder time just with people maining decrees all over the place. But this is a very, very good list here. I think this is very, very good for Chaos Control. I would classify this as Chaos Control, even though it is playing Stein. It's playing some other things as well, but I think this is a very, very good list. And, you know, I think it definitely deserves to be played. If you want to play a deck like this one, where you're not really relying too much on the Stein stuff, you do still have Stein here if you want to play it, but, you know, you're mainly relying on, like, out-resourcing your opponent and stuff like that. I think this is a very, very good deck for you. And now we get into the top two. Second place went to Hoy on this really, really cool Chaos deck. This, you know, again, it's another Chaos Control list, or I guess you could call it Chaos Recruiter. It's playing double Shining Angel, double Mystic Tomato here as well. And, you know, I think it's a very, very good tech. Not many people are playing Shining Angel in this format here, but it can be very good. You know, it gets a Light Engrave, goes into Warrior Lady potentially, which is very strong, or just goes into another Shining Angel, you know, decked into a little bit for you. And that can be very, very nice. Also playing Archfiend Soldiers here, 1900 attack, beats over a lot of things in the format. You can get more aggressive as well. So I think this is also a pretty good card here. And, you know, besides that, playing Triple Chaos Orc, playing the Triple Dust Shoot again, you know, Triple Dust Shoot, really, really big here. You know, I expect to see more of this going forward as people, you know, sort of just adapt this into their decks and base decks off of the topping decks from this list. So, yeah. I think that that's very good. Triple Econ here as well to, you know, switch monsters to defense, take control of the monsters, things like that. Very, very good as well. But no Stein here. So, you know, they're saying, I'm not going to play that Stein game plan. I'm not going to, you know, fall into that trap, go for the 5K. I'm just going to play good old-fashioned Yu-Gi-Oh! And that was enough to bring them to second place. But unfortunately, it was not quite enough to allow them to win the entire tournament. That tournament was won by this deck right here, which is Dark World Burn. Now, I was the pilot of this deck in the tournament, and in that finals game, you know, it's funny because Hoy has a deck that does not play Stein. My deck does have Stein in here as something to go into off of Last Will or something like that because we're playing a lot of tribute monsters, and I managed to basically Stein OTK them twice in a row to win the game very, very quickly. So that sort of does show that even if you, like, play really well with a non-Stein deck and, you know, I'm not saying this will always be the case, but, like, oftentimes if your opponent is just playing Stein in the deck and they can just go into it and they can just win the game off that, right? And it can sort of turn games into non-games. So that is one of the biggest flaws of this format, I think. You know, and that applies to all the sort of Stein OTK era formats where, like, you know, no matter how good the gameplay is when Stein doesn't come into play, there are just games where Stein does come into play. And it basically, you know, turns the games into non-games a lot of the time. So I do think that it is good to have Stein in these decks, but I will say, you know, being the pilot of this deck, I do think that this deck has merit beyond just, like, going to Stein. You know, I won a lot of games not through Stein, just through, you know, getting aggressive with the Dark World monsters and, you know, just playing a good game of Yu-Gi-Oh! That way. I will mention this list is basically the list that Zoidberg used to get second place in a previous format library, Chaos Return format tournament. The change that I made was I had Treeborn Frog. I like Treeborn Frog in this deck because I noticed when I tested out this list beforehand that, you know, occasionally you just brick on a bunch of tribute monsters, and having a Treeborn Frog in rotation makes that a little bit less bricky. So I do like Treeborn Frog in this deck. Another thing I'll note, I did initially like the Thunder Dragons after playing games with them. Like, I thought it was pretty good because occasionally you draw Dark World Lightning in a low resource situation. If you pulled off a Thunder Dragon earlier in the game, you have at least a monster to pitch with that you don't really care about pitching. But I do think in the future I'd probably cut out the Thunder Dragons. They are a little bit bricky, even though they can sort of increase the ceiling on something like a card destruction or something like that. If you're just playing better cards here instead, you don't really need to worry about that too much. So I would say probably in the future, cutting these would be good. And Zoidberg actually mentioned this as the tournament was going on. And I've been convinced. I've been convinced that that is the way to go in the future. So, yeah, cutting Thunder Dragon is definitely the path forward. This deck is still definitely in flux. There are a lot of things you can do with it. And we might see it change even more in the future. I mean, with people playing more Decree, maybe the trap lineup will get pared down a bit. Who knows? But I will say, even though I did face people on Decree, even though I did face people playing like macro stun, where they're just, playing things that banish things from graveyard, which is really bad for this deck because you want to be discarding your things to graveyard and you want to get the Treeborn in rotation as well. I was still able to prevail against those decks and make it to win the entire tournament. So this deck is really, really good. And I encourage people to try it out more in the future. Also, this deck can be played in Stein format. We will be having a Stein format tournament as well coming up pretty soon. So, if you want to play this for that, maybe that's something to test out as well. But that's going to do it for the topping deck list. I highly encourage you to pick these decks up if you do want to play in this format, because I do think that they're all pretty good, and just sort of go with whichever one speaks to you. But since we've wrapped up this tournament and since I wrapped up my Chaos Return format coverage already, let's go over a tier list for this format, just to sort of get my ideas of, where I think each deck lies in the competitive metagame. Okay, now that we've gone through all the topping deck lists from the latest tournament, let's talk about what I think the tier list for this format looks like. Now, before we dive into the decks themselves, I want to explain what each tier here means. I define these tiers based on what I think the results of a tournament in the format will be. So tier 0 deck would be, I think that this deck is just going to take up pretty much all of the top cut, right? Like if 7 out of the 8 top cut slots are one deck, that's a tier 0 format. So if I think that there's one deck that can meet that criteria and just, take up all of the competitive spots at the top level, then I think it's tier 0 format. Tier 1 would be if, I think a deck could very likely win a tournament, but it's not necessarily going to be taking up all the top cut slots, right? And it might not be winning every single tournament, but it is going to be winning a fair amount of tournaments overall. If you bring it to a tournament and you play well, then you could definitely win the tournament with that deck. That's what I classify a tier 1 deck as. Tier 2 decks are decks that I think, it's kind of like tier 1, but with just topping instead of just winning, right? I think it's like not the most likely thing in the world that they'll win. They can win. I'm not saying that they'll never be able to win, but it will take a lot more work to get them to win. But I do think that, with good play and stuff, you can very likely top a tournament with a tier 2 deck. Tier 3, or Rogue here, is just decks that I think it's not the most likely thing that they'll be able to top, but if you work really hard at it, you could potentially get them to top in a tournament. Not to say that they'll never win a tournament, but I think it's even less likely that they'll win than tier 0 or tier 2 decks. And so I don't really think that they're that good if you want to bring a deck to a tournament and actually have a good shot at winning. But if you just want to play a fun deck and maybe be able to top with it and show people that, hey, you can top with this deck, then a Rogue deck might be for you. And then trash tier decks are sort of decks that I don't even think can necessarily win a match. Maybe they'll win a match here or there, but like on average, they're just really, really bad. Really not going to win most of the time. And so it's probably not worth playing if you want to play in a competitive setting, right? So now that I've sort of discussed all the tiers, let's go through each of these decks. And I'm just going to start off with Stein decks. Now, some of the decks on this list are going to be like pretty nebulous. So like Stein is pretty nebulous, I think, because you could play like full-on Stein OTK, you could play Stein Monarch, you could play whatever deck that you're playing with Stein, right? And I sort of have Stein here as sort of just a general representation of the format as a whole. I don't necessarily think if you go all in on the Stein OTK, you're going to be able to be in a tier 1 spot. Like, am I all in on the Stein OTK? I mean, like playing triple Stein, Megamorphs, limit removal, etc. You might not be able to go in the tier 1 spot here. Maybe you will, because it's a good deck in Stein format itself. So, it could potentially be good in Chaos Return as well. It's just people haven't really been testing that out as much as like Stein Monarch and things like that. But I think that whatever form Stein is in, Stein decks will be good in the format. Just being able to win instantly out of nowhere is very good. And so Stein will always be tier 1 in some capacity here, unfortunately. I know a lot of people don't like that sort of thing. I'm not the biggest fan of it either. But, it is a fact of this format. If you play the format, that's what you're signing up for. So it is good to know about there. Next up, I want to mention Chaos in some capacity. This could be... I'm more classifying this as like Chaos Control, like a full-on Chaos deck list that's focusing on not making a huge play with return or something like that, but just, focusing on, out-resourcing your opponent over the course of the game, getting out Chaos Orcs as a tricky late-stage boss to deal with, and doing things like that. This could be a Chaos Monarch list as well. There are a lot of different ways to build Chaos here, but this is more on the controlling side of things. So I think that deck is also going to be tier 1. It's sort of a deck that will always exist in the format that will be powerful, and so I definitely think this deck can win tournaments pretty easily and definitely will always be topping. So lastly, of these sort of like just, tone setting decks that I want to get out of the way right away, Monarchs, I think in some capacity will always be tier 1. The deck is just so good at just getting out big aggressive threats and, potentially killing the Stein Arc. But even if you're just playing Monarchs pure, it has a lot of ways to remove your stuff and just get aggressive. So I think this deck is very, very good. I think that these 3 decks are sort of decks that throughout this era of GX are just dominant throughout, and for good reason. They're very, very strong, and it's very tough for other decks to compete with them, but not impossible. I mean, as we saw from this latest tournament, I think that Dark World is definitely also in this tier 1 contention. If you play it more like the aggressive burn strategy, like me and Joyberg played, I think that this is sort of the way to go with Dark Worlds. I think it is very, very good. It has some great matchups in this format. It had some bad matchups too, but a lot of the bad matchups, I think, for Dark Worlds are decks that are not quite in the tier 1 spot. So I do think that, this deck overall is very, very strong and can definitely just take games out of nowhere. I think in the tier 1 category, I'm not sure if I'd put it like above the others. I mean, it did just win a tournament and it got second in a previous tournament, so maybe I put it like somewhere there. Yeah, just for the sort of controversy, I'm going to put it at the top of tier 1. But I think realistically the thing probably is like in the middle of tier 1, but a lot of these decks sort of go back and forth on the tier 1 chart. Like if I was mixing this up a bit, I'd put Stein down there, because if you go all in on Stein, it can be a bit awkward for you. Maybe Monarch's a little bit above Chaos, but like and then probably Dark World a little bit under Monarchs. I don't know. This is all like a flexible tier 1 spot, but the important thing is that these decks are in tier 1. These are decks that you will have to worry about if you're planning on going to a tournament or playing an online tournament for this format. Then you do need to know about these decks. You need to have plans for these decks, because these decks are going to be very dominant. And if you want to do well in this tournament, then you probably should be playing one of these decks. But there are other decks that can be pretty good, and that takes us to tier 2 contention. I think Warriors, well, we didn't really get to see many pure Warriors in this tournament. I think the Warriors is a very good deck. There are a lot of different ways to build it, like the anti-meta sort of Warrior decks that have been somewhat popular can be good. You can just play pure Warriors as well. And so I think this is tier 2, because people haven't really brought it to the tier 1 contention. They haven't won with the deck. Although I guess you could categorize the deck that Alpha 2 won with, where, it's playing the sort of macro stun stuff with DD survivors and stuff. You could classify that as a Warrior deck. But I think that was more just sort of like lightning in a bottle. I don't think that is, really a super repeatable feat with that style deck, because that deck has some major flaws. So I'll put Warriors in tier 2, along with these sort of more focused like macro decks, whether they be macro Monarchs or just some other form of deck that's, sort of playing things to just banish things before they hit the graveyard, right? So this would be like anti-meta stun decks and stuff like that. I think these are tier 2. I think they have some major flaws. If you draw one part of the deck but not the other, then it can be really bad for you. Like, for instance, if you draw like Dimensional Fissures and Banishers and stuff, but you don't draw anything else, that's really bad, because your opponent, even if they do rely on their graveyard, can just, aggro you out. And likewise, if you draw things like DD Survivor, if you're playing that, but not the banishing stuff, that can also be really bad, because it doesn't really do much on its own. So I do think that these decks are tier 2. Of course, you can build in a way that like you minimize that possibility, like Alpha 2's list in the most recent tournament. But I do think that, these decks probably aren't going to win most of the time. They might win occasionally, as in the previous tournament that happened, but I don't really think that they're the best bet in terms of like the most competitive decks out there. Next up, we got Apprentice Monarch. I think this is also probably tier 2. I mean, it's obviously this is a Monarch deck, right? Like, Monarch decks are going to be strong, but I'm not necessarily sure Apprentice Magician, that engine, is the way to play Monarchs. That can be a strong engine, sure. But I think you just got better engines out there. Like Recruiters is good. This is more Chaos Recruiters, because I'm doing the Shining Angel thing, like Hoy was playing. I think this is also very good. I mean, again, it's like, this is a Chaos deck, just like the Chaos decks that I mentioned in tier 1. Like, Apprentice Monarchs is a Monarch deck, just like I mentioned with Monarchs in tier 1. I'd probably put Chaos Recruiter like up here in the same category as Chaos. I think it's a very, very good way to play the deck. It's just like tricky, because like, again, a lot of the sort of divine lines between the decks are very nebulous, but I'm going to put it in tier 1 up with the Chaos control list. I think that more people will be playing the Recruiters in the Chaos decks in the future, so it'll be interesting to see what people do with that. But I think this is probably a better engine for the deck than something like Apprentice Magician is in Monarchs. Moving on to some of the just other decks in form, now we're getting into sort of like the iffier territory. We get Counter Fairies. I'm going to put Counter Fairies in trash. I love Counter Fairies, so this hurts me to do. But I really do think the deck is bad. You just don't have enough good counter traps to support it. All you've really got in terms of ways to take advantage of your counter traps are like Artemis to draw more things, which is fine. You're getting draws, so that's good. But I think playing some of the more high rolly things that can benefit from counter traps is not really as good in the deck. And it's just not quite there yet. So I think that this is trash here. It just doesn't do enough in this format to actually be good. I also think that Diamond Dude Turbo is also in the trash tier. I'm going to put it slightly above the Counter Fairies decks, but I think that, again, there's just not enough that you can do with this deck. Sure, you can do like Desk Croaking stuff, but as I talked about in my video on Diamond Dude Turbo in this format, your opponent just then doesn't commit anything board for a turn, and you're not aggressive enough to actually win the game from that, and then they just resume what they were doing on the following turn, and they do things like that. So I don't really think this deck is that good. I think it's above Counter Fairies for sure, but like it's just not there yet. And also, that's not even getting into the fact that like you draw things like Desk Croaking or the other spells that you're using with Diamond Dude, then it's really, really bad for you. Next up, we get Heroes. I think Heroes also belongs to trash tier, unfortunately, but I will put it above Diamond Dude Turbo because at least this deck can get a bit aggressive. The flaw with Heroes, though, is that your payoff is not quite there yet. The hero fusions are like not really that good on the whole, and so even if you bring them out, you're not winning the game off that, and you're putting a lot of resources into that. Even if you're using Miracle Fusion to banish 2 things from grave, you had to get those things in grave in the first place, right? And so you had to use them for something, and you're probably a bit down on card advantage there. So I don't really think that Heroes is that good in this format. Still a fun deck to play if you want to, but like definitely a trash tier deck in my opinion. Next up, we've got Zombies. I'm going to put this in Rogue. Andrew _ did manage to top with Zombies here, but the deck just doesn't quite do enough in this format. I think, if you look back at Reaper format and you saw the evolution of Dead Rat over time, and Dead Rat really just dropped off once people learned how to deal with it. I think the same sort of thing in this format. Now, this isn't quite Dead Rat that Andrew _ top with because, they're mainly going into Reapers or other turtles and stuff, so it's a good engine that way. But I think overall, this deck just doesn't do enough. There are other decks that get out better threats and have more, assured removal and things like that. So I think this deck is not quite there. But, it is a fun rogue deck. And, as Andrew _ showed, you can indeed top with it if you play well. Next up, we've got return decks. I'm going to put these in tier 2. This includes like Chaos Return and Bazoo Return and things like that. Return can also be a nice counter against the macro deck, so I am going to put it above macro decks in this listing here. It's kind of weird because the format's named Chaos Return format, but I don't really think Chaos Return is the best deck in the room. Playing it on the channel, I sort of felt like, well, this is all well and good, but you could just be playing, a regular Chaos deck and just be winning that way, right? And I feel like that is the flaw with this deck, is that like it's explosive, sure, but like, are you really doing something better than the typical Chaos control deck is doing? I would say no. Now, if you play a Bazoo Return deck, that might be a bit better, but no one brought that to this event, and no one's really brought that to tournaments in the past. So, I don't really have data on that, so I can't really place it higher than that off what I think the merits of that deck are. But I do think Bazoo Return is a very, very good deck. I think it should be explored a little bit more in this format. But, people aren't really playing it, so I can't really rank it higher than tier 2. But maybe that's a deck that will be tier 1 in the future. Who's to say? Definitely check it out if you are interested in that sort of thing. And bring it to a tournament, prove the naysayers wrong. But anyways, for the last deck here, we've got just any sort of FTK nonsense. I've sort of, represented that by Royal Magical Library here. I'm going to put that in trash here. I think it is above Diamond Dude and Artemis, unfortunately. But I don't really think this deck is that good. Whatever sort of FTK deck you're playing, you just don't have the consistency to actually, pull it off as many times as you need to. And also you do run into the flaw of like, oh, my opponent won the die roll, so they're going first. I'm going second. What do I do now, right? And that can really cause you to lose games over the course of a tournament. And it's very, very. I don't think any deck of this sort is going to top. That's just my opinion on it. I just think statistically can't do enough to get to that unless it's a very, very small tournament. But I think these decks, while scary, are thankfully not really good enough to see major competitive play here. But if you do want to ruin someone's day, you can definitely bring this to a tournament. And I mean, you might not be the most liked person in the world, but you might be able to win a game or two with it. That's going to do it for the tier list. Again, some of these sort of deck types are a bit nebulous here, and I think that's just the nature of the format. Like, there are different ways to build these decks here, and the format's still definitely very much in flux. There's no like sort of nailed down list, like this is what Monarch should look like, this is what Chaos should look like, this is what this deck should look like, right? And I think because of that, it does make it a bit harder to do this sort of tier list here. But hopefully this sort of was helpful for you if you do want to join in a future Chaos Return format event, what deck you might want to bring, what deck you might want to experiment with, and what decks you might want to avoid. But I hope that you enjoyed this video. As always, let me know in the comments below what you think of this tier list and what you think of the topping lists from the tournament. Also, leave it a like as well. Do the regular YouTube things, subscribe, etc. And if you want to support me directly, I do have a Patreon link in the description down below. And if you join the Patreon, you get shouted in the videos. So big shouts to Tyler Compton, Rincewind, Bren Donker, Porkchop Coon, Dumpstruck, and GMYFS. It means a lot that you all support me this way, encourage me to make more videos like this in the future. Join the YGF from Zero Discord server if you want to join future events. And until next time, I've been Ben from YGF from Zero, and I'm signing off.